The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BATIC Institute's webinar on navigating public-private partnerships and environmental review processes. My name is Susan Howard, and I am Director of the BATIC Institute at AASHTO. I'm going to do a very brief introduction and then move on to our panelists because we have a lot of great information today. A couple logistical items. You should have received an email link to the PowerPoint presentations, and if you didn't receive this email, please visit our website. That's financingtransportation.org, and a copy of the PowerPoint will be available there for download. All participants will be on mute. If you have a question at any time, feel free to type it into the question box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, will be available on our website by the end of the day tomorrow. Just a word quickly about the BATIC Institute for those of you who may be new to our webinars. We provide capacity building support to state DOTs and their local partners around project finance and transportation issues. We do this through in-person services such as events and trainings, and through online forums such as this webinar. We also work on research and foster dialogue around transportation finance techniques. Obviously, public-private partnerships have been a big part of that, and I think that this particular issue as it relates to the environmental process has really sprung up through our partnership with the Center for Environmental Excellence, another AASHTO training center, and so I'll say a little bit more about that as we move forward. But we want to thank all of our panelists, and remember that the website, the slides will be available and recording will be available by tomorrow. This webinar will provide an introduction to the relationship between public-private partnerships and changing environmental policy, including a discussion of key legal issues facing P3 projects during that process. There have been a number of research projects and policy guidance documents that examine the intersections of innovative finance and efforts to streamline the environmental approval process. And AASHTO's Center for Environmental Excellence is currently compiling some of that research into a single document, which will be released in the coming weeks. So again, I just want to thank my colleague Melissa Savage, who leads the Center for Environmental Excellence, for this kind of idea to do this webinar as a joint sort of effort between the two groups here within AASHTO. So we're going to talk about specifics to P3s before and during NEPA, unexpected challenges that have arisen in past projects, future trends, and we'll hear about Colorado's Central 70 project and their experience in navigating environmental processes. Our speakers today are Eric Batel of WSP, Bill Malley of Perkins Coie, and Keith Stefanik of the Colorado Department of Transportation. I'm going to turn it over right now to our first speaker. And again, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the box and we will get to them at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. I'm Eric Batel with WSP, and I help lead our environmental process and policy practice. And I'm going to talk through some kind of higher level themes of the intersection between NEPA and P3s and the changing policies of environmental streamlining and how that may affect P3s moving forward. So first question is, why are we talking about this now? Why is it so timely? And I think we all can understand the aging infrastructure that we have and the backlog of projects that are in the hoppers across the states and the lack of sufficient funding to do all of that work right now. And so increasingly, P3s are looked upon as a viable alternative to close a funding gap or to secure full funding for critical infrastructure projects without depleting the limited resources that states have for their transportation programs. Also, in the recent transportation authorization bills, MAP 21 and the FAST Act most recently, Congress has made a devoted effort to make substantive changes to the way that transportation environmental reviews are performed, providing direction on streamlining and providing greater authority for the Department of Transportation and the modal agencies to approve projects through categorical exclusions or take more of a lead in defining project purpose and need and defining the range of alternatives relative to their sister federal agencies. And so with these different changes, with the need for more P3 projects advancing through project delivery and the changes that have occurred to the environmental review process, the intersection is becoming more acute and more interesting for us to understand how to navigate an accelerated environmental review process while also pursuing a P3 arrangement. And so it led to a conversation with AASHTO and the Center on Environmental Excellence to understand, what are some key issues, or try to identify what are some key issues that sponsors, practitioners, investors, the public, permitting agencies, and other folks interested in the process, what do they need to know? How can we lay out a guidance, policy, direction that will help everyone understand how to navigate this changing landscape? Before we get into what is out there to help us understand that nexus or that intersection, it's important to kind of go through some of the recent changes that Congress and presidential administrations have made to accelerate the process. First and foremost among those, I think, is the authority to combine an FEIS, the final environmental impact statement, and the record of decision, foregoing the standard 30-day cooling off period between those documents. That is a singular authority to the Department of Transportation, so other federal agencies don't have that authority, and that unique authority can create challenges down the road as we consider some other policy objectives, such as relying on a single environmental document. The need for greater transparency has been pushed out through legislation as well as presidential policy to create project schedules that account for all of the NEPA milestones as well as the permitting milestones, so that the public can better understand the process and hold agencies accountable to those timelines. They've expanded the flexibility in the use of categorical exclusions, broadened their application to project types. They've also allowed for greater sharing among the transportation modes of categorical exclusion. So while so much of the focus has been on environmental impact statements because those are the biggest and most complex projects, there are many more projects that are now being addressed through categorical exclusions. And how does that necessarily impact a P3 procurement? Is there still a financially viable process or project that can be cleared through a CE that a P3 would be attractive? And thus, is there some focus that may warrant some attention? Because traditionally, we really pay attention to the big, complex, expensive projects, but those streamlining advantages through CEs and P3s may also be viable and an alternative that we should explore further. There's also been an emphasis on expanding programmatic approaches, looking at things from a program perspective so that you don't have to do one-off approvals for, say, impacts to protected species or historic properties or mitigation approaches, so that you understand the expectations for project mitigation at the outset before you advance through the NEPA process. And that is particularly interesting from a P3 perspective, because if you explore programmatic mitigation at a planning level or at a program level, and you have P3 agreements that are pieces of that program, the concessionaire or the developer would know at the outset what their expectations are for certain impacts. And I think there's room for exploration and investigation there as well. A few more things to highlight would be the strengthening of the planning and environmental linkages approach, where you front load much of the environmental considerations into the transportation planning process and allow you to identify a range of alternatives, the purpose and need for the project that you then carry forward into NEPA in a more streamlined fashion. So you're able to hit the ground running in NEPA and ideally shorten the overall process. And then expanding the NEPA assignment program was a key element of MAP 21 that changed what was once a pilot program that authorized the Federal Highway Administration to transfer its federal responsibilities under NEPA and other environmental laws to the states, who are willing to meet a number of criteria, such as waiving sovereign immunity, subjecting themselves to the jurisdiction of federal courts for lawsuits on NEPA decisions that they would make. To date, since MAP 21 has expanded that program, 7 states have assumed full program assignment responsibilities, with California also pursuing assignment responsibilities from the FRA for their California high-speed rail program. So this is a topic that is becoming more common across the states, and that also presents some interesting questions. As I mentioned, we were tasked by the Center for Environmental Excellence at AASHTO to do a scan of what policies or guidance documents or research has been done that discusses the intersection of NEPA and P3 projects. And there's some, but I think the ultimate conclusion is that there may not be enough. Federal Highways has issued a series of guidance documents and tools on the development of P3 arrangements. Most of that, however, is focused on the procurement side. How do you identify financial risk? How do you provide oversight of a P3 arrangement to ensure that the public interests are maintained? Much of that is really, on the financial side of the house, the contracting and procurement side, and less on the NEPA side. There is some mention, but perhaps not as much as might be helpful. In 2013, the National Academy of Sciences issued a document with a fairly long title, but the gist of it is, looking at the procurement process and how innovative procurement and innovative financing, how that relates to the environmental review process. It really, that document starts to explore the relationship between NEPA and procurement, but the majority of the case studies that were the foundation of that document followed a sequential process. So they had completed NEPA on a project, and then they initiated procurement. That is, while still common, there are more and more. There's an emphasis on trying to align those or move those up to occur more concurrently to shorten the overall timeline for delivery. So there may be room there. There's an NCHRP document that was released in 2011 with Volume 1 and Volume 2 in 2016 that talks about managing NEPA risk. It doesn't specifically speak to P3s, but it does raise a number of topical areas that are relevant to P3s. But again, managing NEPA risk is a large universe of topics, and there are some unique risks to P3s, and I think there may be room there that we might also have an opportunity to explore. And then most recently, in April of this year, NCHRP 2525 Task 109 was a research product describing the best practices for ensuring environmental commitments in public-private partnerships and design-build contracts, where you would make certain commitments in the record of decision or through permit conditions, and what are the best practices to carry those forward to ensure that the contractor responsible for actually doing the construction work and potentially operating the facility, how do you ensure that they comply with those conditions? How do you ensure that the mitigation commitments that were made, that were part of the environmental document, not only to meet federal law, but also ostensibly as a way to mitigate public perception of the environmental impacts, you need to ensure that the private entity who is now constructing and operating follows through on those commitments. And it outlines a number of best practices, such as standardizing environmental commitments for a program of projects that may have multiple RFPs, creating an environmental commitment tracking database, transferring risk, both in time and money, of the potential for reevaluations or the revisiting of NEPA decisions to ensure that design modifications that may be advanced by the design build firm or the concessionaire, that they're consistent with the underlying NEPA document. That really encourages or incentivizes them to stay within the footprint that was cleared under the NEPA document, or at least be consistent with the NEPA document. And as well as incentivizing environmental performance through the procurement process, either rating those that have innovative solutions for environmental mitigation or minimizing impacts, or other ways where they get financial bonuses, or a variety of, there's any number of contracting means that may be available. But the foundational point is, how do you ensure that the environmental outcomes that the public may seek are transferred to the private entity responsible for developing the project?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Malley. I'm with Perkins Coie Law Firm in Washington, D.C. This portion of the webinar will cover key legal issues involving NEPA for public-private partnerships, or P3s. So I'm going to begin with an introduction and then turn to some specific legal issues that do come up when preparing NEPA documents for P3s. First, it's worth thinking about what makes P3s different and what are some of the NEPA complications or challenges or issues that arise from the distinct aspects of P3s. And the reason I start with this is that, of course, in many ways, P3s are similar. They're big, complex projects that require, and oftentimes, a complex NEPA document or process to go through. But there are some distinct aspects, which I cover here on the left side of the slide. Number one, we're talking about initiating a large contract that includes design and construction in many cases while the NEPA process is ongoing. So you're introducing this procurement in parallel with NEPA. Inherent in this procurement process where you're trying to attract interest from the P3 community is a desire to provide some certainty about when the NEPA process will be complete, because that's so critical to the P3 partners' interest in committing the resources necessary for the procurement when they have many investment opportunities available to them. In terms of the design process, NEPA traditionally involves enough environmental engineering to carry out the environmental process. and that's often described as preliminary engineering. With the P3, it's not necessarily that the design level is going to be higher or lower, but there's this important consideration for how do we preserve flexibility for the P3 so that they can add value when they're on board to find a more efficient way to accomplish a given objective. There's also often, not always, but often a desire to shift some permitting risk from the state to the P3 partner. And so while NEPA is its own requirement, there's also a whole set of requirements associated with environmental permits, especially Section 404 permitting. And in a traditional procurement method, the state is the permit applicant. With the P3, there may be a desire to hand off certain permitting responsibilities to that P3 partner, and that involves, in a sense, disaggregating responsibilities that otherwise would be housed within the state. And then lastly, there's often a greater focus on project economics, looking at, is this project, especially if it's a toll project, financially viable as a P3? Because if it doesn't pencil out, then you don't have a P3. And so it's starting to front load some of those financial considerations into the NEPA process. So how does this play out? And that's on the right side of the screen. Obviously, heightened schedule pressure, a much greater emphasis on determining, sometimes even committing almost, how soon can we get this NEPA process complete? Balancing the NEPA and the P3 procurement, essentially two parallel timelines, and figuring out which milestone, say in NEPA, needs to happen before a given milestone in the P3. That's going to be a big focus of this presentation. There are concerns about what can the state do in NEPA versus what can the P3 partner do, and does the procurement process itself, or does the involvement of the P3 partner specifically create bias, create some kind of lack of objectivity in the NEPA process? And I'll talk further about that as well. By the same token, there can also be concerns that the NEPA process could be too prescriptive, thereby tying the hands of the P3 partner and limiting the value that one achieves or should achieve through a P3 agreement. If you're too prescriptive, the hands are tied. You don't get the benefit of that innovation that the P3 partner should bring. Carrying that further out, there are ways to modify a design and to, in a sense, untie the hands of that P3 partner, but that brings into play this issue of supplementation. And when supplementation arises, who bears the risk of preparing a supplemental NEPA document? Who bears the risk of deciding that a supplemental is not needed and documenting that decision? And then lastly, this issue of permitting risk, who bears what aspect of that risk, and then how that ties into litigation risk. And so the topics that I have on the right side of the screen are topics that I'm going to cover in the remainder of this presentation. Just as a frame of reference for what I'm about to cover, I'm going to lay out two timelines and talk a little bit more about what those timelines look like of NEPA and a P3 procurement. Next slide. So on this slide, I have what I've described as a very illustrative NEPA and P3 timeline. And the very is included on this slide because these bubbles that you see both in the NEPA row and the P3 row, they can be moved in lots of different directions, left and right, relative to one another. And there are many, many permutations on how this could unfold. So the reason I lay this out is to just provide a point of reference. And I think the first takeaway from this slide is that in most cases for a complex project that involves an EIS, involves some kind of large-scale P3, there is going to be some overlap between the NEPA timeline and the P3 timeline. And that a constant sort of issue or question for the state in trying to guide and direct the NEPA process, guide and direct P3, is the relative timing of these different milestones. As I'll talk about later, it is possible to initiate and to even conclude your P3 procurement while NEPA is still underway. It's a judgment call about whether the state wants to do that. Another important takeaway from this slide is that there's this window of time that's after the ROD where litigation can ensue challenging that ROD. And there's lots of other activities that could be going on related to the P3 during that litigation time period. Reevaluations to determine that a supplemental is not needed, actual preparation of a supplemental EIS, and challenges and potentially to those decisions not to reevaluate, for example, and of course, permitting. So what that all means is that the ideal of having a purely sequential approach, finish environmental, then do P3, doesn't often arise in the real world. And so that's why this coordination becomes so important. So taking what I've just covered, I'm going to break that down into 6 issues and just talk through, for each of those 6 issues, what I see as the kind of key legal principle that's important to be aware of, and then what are some of the issues or risks that need to be managed when coordinating the NEPA process with the P3 procurement. And you'll see just from the bullets on the screen that each of these tie into some of what I've described in the first slide as distinctive issues associated with NEPA for P3s. First, we'll talk about the relative timing of NEPA versus the P3 procurement. The key legal principle to start with is that in order to protect the integrity of the NEPA process, which is intended to be a true decision-making process with public involvement, where the agency is actually considering that public input in order to make a decision on a project, there's a general principle that the agencies that are leading that process should avoid actions that would undermine the integrity of the NEPA process by rendering that decision a foregone conclusion or a fait accompli. So that principle is implemented by federal highway with regulations that say no final design, no right-of-way acquisition, no construction prior to NEPA completion. And there's some exceptions with regards to right-of-way acquisition, but there's this general principle. And so the question is, what does that mean for P3? So fortunately, in part through legislative action where Congress has actually amended the law, and then that's been implemented through what are called the Design Bill of Regs, it is clearly established that a P3 procurement process can be initiated during NEPA, the P3 partner can be selected, the contract awarded, and even the notice to proceed given, all prior to NEPA completion. But that notice to proceed would be limited to certain pre-construction activities. So there is that clarity that these can be done in parallel, but there's also a bright line as to what can't be done. So what are some of the issues or risks that need to be considered here? One is that even though the concept is established that you can do these in parallel, there could be allegations that the commitment to the P3 somehow bias the NEPA process because the language in the procurement documents may treat the choice among alternatives as a foregone conclusion, while multiple alternatives are still under consideration. So folks who are on the NEPA side of the house should be involved in developing those procurement documents to ensure that those documents, whether they're the RFP language or the actual language of a contract, don't send a message that is inconsistent with the integrity of the NEPA process. By the same token, delays in the NEPA process can hamper those procurement efforts. So if NEPA's bogged down, the state loses its credibility over in the P3 procurement process because it seems that, hey, you're not making any progress. So it becomes really important on the NEPA side to keep things moving and provide clarity to those on the procurement side so that they can maintain credibility with that P3 marketplace. And then, it's a given, but really important that if there are challenges to the NEPA process, those can lead to delay damages under P3 agreement once you have that agreement in place. And so thinking about that risk sharing is going to be very, very important. It might cause the state, in some cases, to decide not to execute that P3 agreement until after they've gotten through that litigation window or to certain milestones in litigation. I'll next turn to the role of the P3 partner in the NEPA process. When you think about the role of the P3 partner, so much of a public-private partnership is about taking certain responsibilities that traditionally would be borne by the state and then shifting them onto P3 partners and allowing them to manage the project across the board, across multiple dimensions of project development and implementation. But there are certain inherent limits. The key principles that public agencies must remain in control of the NEPA process. There's authority to assign federal highways role to a state, but you don't have anything equivalent that says, hey, state, you can hand it off to the private party. So that's the fundamental principle that you can't privatize the responsibility for preparing an EIS. There's greater leeway for EAs and for CEs and for reevaluations for a private party to prepare that documentation, but really an EIS has to remain in the control of that public agency. So what can P3 partners do? There are opportunities for that P3 partner, if they're on board during NEPA, to provide input, and that can be incredibly valuable, whether that's design plans, whether that's environmental data and reports, whether that's even paying for the cost of NEPA through a third-party contract or MOU. And so there is a topic that here that requires real attention and focus in terms of if you have a P3 partner on board, say between the draft and the final EIS, what type of structure can be put in place to enable that contractor to provide input, to add value, but also to stay on the right side of the line and so that they're not overstepping what is proper for the role of a private party. In terms of issues and risks, again, we come back to the issue of bias. Did that P3 partner's involvement create bias in the NEPA process? And if there's a litigation challenge, often that's what's alleged. And, the challenge might point to language in the agreement, might point to email traffic, might point to other aspects of the interaction with the P3 partner that give the impression that the P3 partner was running calling the shot, and that can be a source of risk to the integrity of the NEPA process. The flip side of this risk is that if you create too absolute of a firewall, that you shut out the P3 to avoid that bias risk, but thereby lose some of the value of a P3 because you're not communicating. So now you've got a NEPA document that's approving a project that's out of sync with what the P3 is planning to do. And now you're just shoving problems down the road where you'll have to do reevaluations or even supplementation when you're better coordinated with the P3 and realize that what they're planning is different from what was covered in the environmental document. This topic is economic factors in screening of alternatives. So as I mentioned in the beginning, financial viability becomes a bigger issue in the NEPA process for a P3, especially when tolls are involved. And when you think about the NEPA principle that governs alternatives, it's that all reasonable alternatives must be considered in an environmental impact statement. But Federal Highways recognized, and this goes back to a guidance document issued in 2004, is that financial viability can be considered in determining what is, quote, a reasonable alternative. And in the P3 context, that can include looking at what would it take to attract P3 investors. Most projects don't pay for themselves entirely. The state might have determined that it can allocate a certain amount of public funds under certain terms, and now it's trying to determine, okay, will that be a financial package that would be attractive to investors? And so that could play into this determination of what is a reasonable alternative. But I was also recognized that if you're relying on tolling as a revenue source to meet fiscal constraint, you can use that as a basis for eliminating non-tolled alternatives. That could also be really valuable in the context of a NEPA process for a P3 that involves tolling. The crux of the issue, though, is that when you're making decisions in NEPA, you have to support those with reasoning and with facts. And so if we're saying it's not financially viable because we have to finish the rest of that sentence, explain why. And that really starts to bring into NEPA some issues that might otherwise be seen as outside of NEPA about the financial analysis, about the market conditions. And so when that's happening very early in NEPA, when you don't have a whole lot of information about your P3, it can be hard to connect these together. So that's an opportunity, but also a challenge. As I mentioned at the outset, supplementation risk, I think, it's a part of any NEPA process, but perhaps heightened with a P3. The general legal principle is that federal agencies have a continuing duty to consider new information and change circumstances. That includes project design changes. They have to assess whether that's a significant new information or significant change circumstance. If so, prepare a supplemental EIS. And the decision not to prepare a supplemental EIS can be challenged. That's a decision in its own right. And of course, the supplemental EIS, if prepared, can also be challenged. So there's this interplay where you've got the P3 developing design changes, and then you've got the state and the federal agency evaluating whether that requires supplementation. Host of issues come out of that. A big part of it is going to be minimizing the number of those changes that even need to be evaluated, but then determining, okay, when they do exist, do we take each little one and address it separately? Do we bundle them? What's the role of the P3 in developing that documentation? And these are inherent issues in any P3, need to be carefully managed because those decisions can be challenged. The P3 partner's role in permitting, as I mentioned at the outset, the P3 partner can be the applicant for a permit, for all permits. And a key permit for most big projects is the Section 404 permit issued by the Corps. That's a federal action, and that's an action that can be challenged. With the recent One Federal Decision MOU, there's really an emphasis now in NEPA and 404 decisions occurring simultaneously, as the term One Federal Decision would suggest. That calls into question the model that has been used on some projects where the state gets to the NEPA finish line, then hands off permitting, including 404 permitting, to the P3 partner to lead and have that occur at a later time. With One Federal Decision, it's more likely those will occur simultaneously. And so one of the questions that rises out of that is it still viable, is it still desirable to push the 404 permitting responsibility onto the P3? Related question is, what is the P3 partner's responsibility or risk if the 404 permit is challenged? This comes up if you have shifted that risk in the sense that they are responsible to prepare and submit the permit. What happens if that permit is challenged, or if you have litigation that results in an injunction in the context of the 404 permit challenge? It might seem like that could be bifurcated, but often the litigation issues are so intertwined. We'll turn next to a slide that addresses litigation risks. So the key point just to note here is that final actions by federal agencies can be challenged in federal court, and those challengeable actions include the initial NEPA decision document, decisions not to supplement, the actual supplemental EIS itself when prepared, and then federal approvals and permits such as the 404 permit. There's a statute of limitations of 150 days, which is your window to challenge those decisions. Each decision has its own challenge window. And so that means that if those decisions happen at different times, there's a series of different litigation windows that stretch out over time. Importantly, that 150-day period only applies if a Federal Register notice is issued that announces the decision. If that notice is not issued, it's a 6-year period. So what this means is that if you go back to that initial diagram that I showed, that there's not just a single litigation window. There's a litigation window that could stretch out over a long period of time after the NEPA process is completed, and that makes it difficult to achieve closure on litigation risk. So just a few final thoughts. Goes without saying, but every P3 is unique. Lessons from one may not apply to the next. So what's the right NEPA strategy? Best way to coordinate NEPA and P3 for one project is not going to necessarily apply to the other. I think at the same time, I think it is fair to say that the very simple approach of let's do this sequentially is rarely the right answer. When you balance all the different considerations that a state may have, in some form or fashion, they're going to, in most cases, overlap, and that the challenge is going to be how do you conduct, in some form, NEPA permitting P3 on timelines that overlap, kind of balancing the risks and demands of each process. And I think that's really the core of any kind of strategy for a NEPA process for a P3 project. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we have an inherent risk that is associated with litigation challenges, both the NEPA and the permitting piece, and that can't be quickly extinguished. It's a risk that's likely to have a long tail and extend well beyond the completion date of NEPA. And so rather than thinking, okay, we're going to make that go away, we're going to manage it down and gradually reduce it over time is a much better way to think about it. So that concludes this portion of the presentation. And now we'll hear from Keith Stefanik about the Central 70 project.
Thanks, Bill. My name is Keith Stefanik. I'm the Central 70 Project Director for the Colorado Department of Transportation for the Central 70 project. The Central 70 project is located on the I-70 corridor right in the heart of Denver. It's between I-25 and Tower Road. I-70 is one of the most heavily congested and traveled routes within the state of Colorado. I-70 leads up to a major tourism point up into the mountains, up near Vail, Keystone, Breckenridge, etc. And then also on the other end, on the east side, you have Denver International Airport. So not only is I-70 very well needed for the state of Colorado, just on the weekly commuters and the economic development down in the city of Denver, but also up in the mountains. We started taking a look at the I-70 corridor back in 2003. It was what we deemed the I-70 East Environmental Impact Statement. What that consisted of back in 2003 was a joint project with the Regional Transportation District, RTD, out here in the state of Colorado. We were looking at both transit and roads. So we had a combined study. That study was combined till about 2006 when the I-70 portion, the roadway portion, we could not really decide on an alternative. So we split it into what we call the I-70 East Environmental Impact Statement, kind of the same name, and carried on. But then RTD split off with the East Corridor Environmental Impact Statement. So they moved away from us and started studying the A-line out to DIA from Union Station in downtown Denver. You know, again, we started in 2003. We got a record of decision in January 2017, so it was a 14-year duration. So it was a very long time, a lot of public input, a lot of alternatives are not analyzed. Really, the goal of the I-70 East Corridor study was to implement a transportation solution to provide safety, access, mobility, and address its connection down in the metro area. So just a look at the NEPA timeline. Again, we began in 2003 with the start of the EIS. In 2008, there was a draft EIS published. We really could not get consensus on a preliminary preferred alternative, so we formed what we refer to as a PAC process. It was Preferred Alternative Collaborative Team. And that process was a bunch of the local stakeholders trying to get together with the community and discuss all the alternatives and really weigh in on the pros and cons and see what we could get to a collaborative approach and see if we could arrive at a preliminary identified preferred alternative. That was unsuccessful. The PAC process really didn't lead us to where we wanted to go. So in 2012, CDOT and other stakeholders really took a second review of the alternatives. And that's really when we started focusing on where we are today with what we call the partial covered lowered alternative. So we started taking a look at that, developing that, and that led into the supplemental draft EIS, which identified the PCL as a preliminary identified alternative in 2014. We then moved into a final EIS in 2016, which named the PCL as the preferred alternative. And then we moved into a record of decision in January of 2017. which really was a phased approach in the EIS process, being that we couldn't fund the entire I-70 East preferred alternative. We had to look into a phasing option, so we coined it the Central 70 project, and then we moved forward with that record of decision, and then we began construction in 2018. So throughout that entire process, we had a very extensive public outreach process. We had over 200 plus community meetings, small block meetings, corridor wide, not just in the residential section. We also held 3 telephone town halls. We had thousands of flyers, email blasts, fact sheets sent out, distributed to all the local libraries, community centers, anything we could. And then we participated in over, it says 20 plus, but I'd say more likely in the 50s numbers of attendance at community events, church care events, anything we could do to get the word out and get the community's input. So while we were focused on the NEPA process, we also had to try to procure this and really administer this project. So we started kind of, I wouldn't say complete parallel, but in 2013, we really started taking a look at how we procure the project. And so we hired some advisors and started taking really a look at a value for money analysis, which began in December of 2013, to really take a look at what kind of procurement options are out there and how we could deliver this project. And then in 2014, it was a big year for us on the procurement side. We really did a lot of focus, went back to our executive management team and our transportation commission with a lot of updates almost on a monthly basis. This breakdown between January and December of 2014 really shows some of the stuff that we focused on anywhere beginning in January. We took a look at initial project cost estimates, different type of funding scenarios, and then what really the impact to our major funding source, Bridge Enterprise. How did that impact Bridge Enterprise throughout the state of Colorado? In February, we took a look at how you transfer risk in a private-public partnership, what the benefits are, to see if P3 was even something that was viable to the state of Colorado. In April, we really drilled down to the source of fundings, wanted to make sure that we had enough funding that was available to try to take a look at these different type of procurement options. And to do that, we had to do a lot of outreach and communication efforts, not only on the NEPA side, but also through our high-performance transportation enterprise. We had to take a look at how we could be transparent and get out to the community of how we were going to fund this project. In June, we really broke down phasing options we knew we couldn't fund the entire I-70 East preferred alternative. We had to focus on what options we could to get a reliable trip and still meet the purpose and need of the project. We really started taking a look at a P3 versus a design build, kind of narrowing down on how we wanted to deliver this. And then we went through, like I said, our first round of transparency options through our high performance transportation enterprise. A big milestone for us was in July of 2014, where we received a resolution from our Transportation Commission directing HPTE to further pursue the P3 opportunity for this project. That was a good milestone for us to really start getting into some details of the P3 procurement and how we could make this thing a reality. In November, we really focused on more extensive public outreach efforts on the transparency side of HPTE. We developed our funding options, and then we really started taking a look at, even though we were directed for a P3, there's several different delivery models of the P3: toll revenue, availability payment, DBOM versus DBFOM, et cetera, that we really needed to take a look at and see where we would arrive. In December, we got a decision from our Transportation Commission on really the project of the preferred scope of work. So what we could do out of that preferred alternative of the I-70 East EIS, what we could deliver in our first phase, which we deemed as Central 70. In January 2015, we prepared a detailed value for money analysis that really focused on those different P3 procurement types. And in February 2015, we had a resolution from our Transportation Commission to choose DBFOM model of the P3, which is design, build, finance, operate, maintain. So those previous 2 slides, I walked through really the NEPA timeline and then the procurement timeline. So what this graphic here really overlays how those 2 work together and how we really move through with the parallel procurement. So just to recap, up on top on the NEPA EIS timeline, so in August 2014 is where we really had that supplemental draft EIS, which that again identified our preliminary preferred alternative, the PCL, partial covered lowered. In January of 2016, again, we had the final EIS, which named the preferred alternative, so it took the preliminary off of it. And really in that, where we squeezed in at that point in time is on the bottom side, on the delivery, a request for qualifications was issued in March of 2015. So March of 2015 falls in between that August and January of 2016 timeline. So once we knew where we were headed with the final EIS and we got the permission from our Transportation Commission to procure this as a P3, we really turned the trigger on. So that, again, that was the previous slide. noted that was in February of 2015. So you can see in March, we went right out with a request for qualifications to get the procurement started. So then right after the RFQs, we followed up with some draft requests for proposals. We had a very long procurement time. As the NEPA timeline stretched out, so did our procurement timeline, which it was a good and bad thing. It allowed us to really focus in on 4 shortlisted teams, had a lot of input on the requirements of the RFP, anything from the commercial side to the technical side. So it gave us a lot of time to really negotiate risk and also negotiate performance and prescriptive specifications throughout the documents. So we did the numerous amendment of the RFP. So first one came out in September of 2015, followed by a second one in February of 2016, leading down to the last draft amendment in October of 2016. So this is really, the next step is really where how everything aligns is we got a record of decision for the Central 70 project, which was kind of phase 1 of the I-70 East environmental impact statement. That was issued in January of 2017. What that allowed us to was really to finalize the RFP. So we issued the final request for proposals in March of 2017. So you can see we got the ROD in January 2017 and then finalized the details of our RFP to align to that decision document. We issued that in March of 2017, and then we selected a developer in August of 2017. So I think the team submitted their proposals in June of 2017. We had a little bit of a review time there, probably 6 weeks, before we selected Kiewit Meridian Partners as our preferred developer in August of 2017. And the most important aspect of this, again, is the public outreach. We continued public outreach through this entire process. So we never went silent on the community through both the NEPA and the procurement processes. We had different public meetings. We had public meetings on the NEPA end, but also High Performance Transportation Enterprise also had their transparency meetings as well. So just a little bit of information on the public-private partnership for the Central 70 project. What we're doing here is we're financing a project through the P3, which can allow a project to be completed sooner or make it possibly happen in the first place. If you don't have funding for a project, it's never going to happen. The P3 aspect allowed us to move this project ahead and accelerate it. Really, a private partner participates in designing, completing, implementing, and funding the project, and then allows the public partner to focus on defining and monitoring compliance with the objectives. The Central 70 project is a P3. It's between High Performance Transportation Enterprise, the Colorado Bridge Enterprise, and Kiewit Meridian Partners. So CDOT is actually not a contractual partner to the project. We administer the project through resolutions from the HPTE and BE boards, but the main contract is through our 2 enterprises and Kiewit Meridian Partners. The Central 70 project, like I said, is a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain delivery model. What a portion of that model is, it's an availability payment deal. So you have toll deals and you have availability payment deals. Here, the enterprises will be making a payment back to Kiewit Meridian Partners for 30 years. It'll be a set payment with escalation rates on that. The toll revenue is maintained by HPTE. So the toll revenue does not go to the developer. We use that toll revenue to maintain the corridor, and it probably pays for a portion of the operations and maintenance of that availability payment. Important thing on this project is for a lot of state agencies is CDOT maintains ownership of I-70. It's not, we turn the ownership over to a private company. They really do that through a lease or a license agreement on the project. And really what it comes down to, in exchange for the developer constructing the project and keeping the project in compliance, we make those availability payments, we as in the enterprises in the state of Colorado. So a big component of the I-70 East project is not just the infrastructure that we're building out here throughout the community and throughout Denver. Is we really had to focus on our mitigation commitments. I-70 is impacted the residents back when it was initially constructed in the 60s. We wanted to make sure we didn't repeat any of the wrongs from back then. So we came up with an extensive mitigation program, probably some of the foremost mitigations that you'll see across the country. A lot of these are probably the first time state agencies have done this, but it was important for us to make this commitment to get this project came through. So this is just a list of a lot of the mitigations we had on the project. The first one, Swampy Elementary School. We had to make modifications to an adjacent school to make sure that that school, one, could make it through the construction of this project, and then also post-construction it had a viable home within the community. So CDOT committed about $18.5 million towards that mitigation that was funded by CDOT, DPS, Denver Public Schools, performed those improvements outside of our Central 70 contract. CDOT also made a commitment to affordable housing, and we did a $2 million grant through an RFP process. We chose a preferred builder, and they're off building some affordable housing through the community. We also did a home improvements project, so a block north and a block south of the I-70 corridor between Brighton Boulevard and Colorado Boulevard, which is about a 2-mile stretch. We did a commitment to make home improvements to those adjacent homes. So you had to be within that boundary. There was about 283 homes. We went through and did anything from storm windows to portable AC units, attic insulation, thermostat replacements, safety checks throughout the home. We did this in partnership with the City and County of Denver. They leveraged some money on their hand to come up with some improvements that they could do. And then we had our federally mandated improvements from a CDOT perspective that we could do. So we joined forces and made those home improvements. CDOT's commitment was about $2.4 million. The city's was about 1.6 for a total of $4 million. We also contributed to a fresh food access. We did an IGA with City and County of Denver. The Globeville area Swansea neighborhood out here is a food desert. So we wanted to try to get some food into this neighborhood. So we committed $100,000. We also have a transportation demand management company, a nonprofit, NEPA, that we're working with through the life of the construction period of this project. So we have a $2.5 million commitment for them to get out and try to get other modes of transportation, other modes of mobility, bike libraries, walking libraries, shuttles, RTD passes, anything we could do to try to get people out of their cars into other modes of transportation during construction. Then we also stood up a training center building out here. We have a extensive workforce development program that we're doing here with a pilot program with FHWA to try to get local workforce to build this project. So we stood up a workforce training center out here to try to get this moving. So we had a total of about $25.6 million in the mitigation commitments out here, funded separately by CDOT, not in the contract with KMP. That really helped us there. And then on the below here, we just have some leveraged commitments that we did with some of our partners throughout here. I alluded earlier to the commitment from the City and County of Denver. I said 1.6, but it was 1.4 million. We also have some leverage from the P3s Foundation. They've committed to $1 million. It's going to be distributed over an annual basis, however they see that funding needed. We partnered with the Regional Air Quality Council, the RAC out here in the state of Colorado, for $1 million of diesel retrofits for our contractors. And then we also have commitments from our developers. So they went above and beyond the commitments that we have from a ROD perspective and proposed some of these commitments that I'll get on to the next slide and talk to you guys about. So our partners, Kiewit Meridian Partners, really focused on the community during their proposal, and what they came up with is to leverage $200,000 during construction and $800,000 over the 30-year operating period. So these are just some of the programs that they're committed to out here during the construction on the left-hand side of the screen, and then on the operating period on the right. And what's really important here is these last two slides that I talked about are only a portion of the commitments that CDOT committed to with the record of decision. We had over 148 mitigations throughout the record of decision, and some of those were better seen to be performed by the developer, Kiewit Meridian Partners, or some of those were better to be completed by CDOT. And what we did is in our RFP, we wrote a reference document that really took the mitigation measures in the ROD and put in a responsible party to that. So the developer knew exactly what they needed to commit to during the construction and the operating periods, and CDOT knew exactly what we had to do to maintain and to finalize those mitigation commitments. So it was really who was best to do it. If it was something to do with construction, like dust control or anything like that, we gave that to the developer. Here, mitigations or fresh food access or workforce development, which we could leverage a lot of partners on the state side, we kept that responsibility. So it was a combined effort to really get this project kicked off and going. One of the last things that I want to touch base with you all is really from a design aspect. We had a very complicated design out here, and there was some things that we as a department could focus on and try to get more details while we were doing the RFP. So the cover, for example, we have a 4-acre park over the highway out here. We had 4 shortlisted teams pursuing this project. There was probably a lot of ideas and themes that these 4 teams could come up with. What we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure the community got what we were promising through the EIS process. So the state went into some more detailed design and really worked with our stakeholders, being City and County of Denver, Denver Public Schools, and the community to see what they really wanted to see on this cover. So we moved towards more of a contract drawing during the procurement process and really made some commitments in there, narrowed the scope down for the developer so that they exactly could see, these 4 shortlisted teams could see what we were pursuing. So we tried to level the playing field and didn't have a lot of optimization or innovation on that cover. Where we saw some innovation at is the actual structure itself, but not what's really on top of it. We wanted to make sure we got the community what they really wanted throughout there. So that's just one example of a lot of the details in the RFP that we really took a look at. Who was better to lead an effort? Was it the department or was it one of our private partners? So to really finish things up, just want to note, we had parallel procurements. It is a difficult thing trying to focus on getting a record of decision and doing everything you need to do in a NEPA document, but also trying to get a procurement started and negotiating with some teams on a P3 model. It's definitely difficult to have those two running parallel. We had kind of two separate teams. We had the NEPA team, we had the procurement team, but we also had some of the department and some of our consultants who were focused on both. So it was a very collaborative approach. It was difficult at times. The RFP definitely drug out a little bit when we really couldn't lock in some stuff on the NEPA side. But what that allowed us to do is really negotiate that risk and get the team's perspective on it. I know the teams probably didn't want to see an extended procurement, but in the end, I think it was very beneficial to the project to be able to spend some of that extra time with the teams and negotiate throughout. So with that, I will turn it back over to Susan Howard and wait for the Q&As.
Thank you so much, Keith. So yes, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to try to get through as many as we can and promise that we'll get answers to those of you who ask questions that we don't have time to get to. The first question I think I'm going to probably direct towards Eric and maybe Bill as well. But given the evolving state of this field, what are some promising areas for future policy research and areas where you think guidance development is needed?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. I think we touched on a little bit in the first part of the presentation, but really having some guidance, best practices around aligning the procurement and the NEPA process, setting up some expectations that are somewhat standard across, even though each P3, as Bill noted, each P3 is different. Managing that process in a way that provides some predictability, not only to industry and the agencies undergoing NEPA, but also to the public to help them better understand that process and how they interplay. I think there's also some room for exploration in the use of the planning and environment linkages process to help to identify whether a P3 is appropriate early in planning so that you can set the stage for a more efficient NEPA document that studies a P3 project and that is more transparent to the public. And then one other area that we have kind of kicked around as part of this effort is an exploration of how the states with NEPA assignment are approaching P3 procurement, since they hold the entirety of the process at that point. There's no longer necessarily a federal oversight role on the NEPA process that may give the public comfort. So are there unique challenges for states with NEPA assignment to navigate as they go through a P3 procurement, and what are those, and can that inform a larger national discussion?
Great, thank you. Let's see. Next, I'll go to, let's go to a question for Bill. How can a project sponsor best build a legally defensible record when moving through two separate but related processes, NEPA and procurement?
So a couple of thoughts. One is that it's important for the NEPA team to understand the P3 procurement, and for the P3 team, procurement team, to understand sensitivities on the NEPA side, so that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, helping each very distinct group of experts to think about these joint processes from the perspective of the other. That just helps to make sure that each can spot risks that might be relevant and sort of manage them collaboratively without surprises, or hopefully avoiding surprises. I think related point is to understand the kinds of challenges that could be brought that are typically going to be more associated with this type of project where you're doing NEPA and P3 together. So one of the key themes, and it comes up very frequently in litigation, is bias, predetermination, and the kinds of statements that could be made in a procurement document that are trying to engage the P3 proposers to convey a sense of confidence, to convey certainty, to provide a more definite statement of where we're headed. All of those things, which can be great in the P3 context, could create some issues, risks, et cetera, on the NEPA side by conveying, perhaps inadvertently conveying or leaving the impression that the process is a foregone conclusion. So, understanding that, I think, helps to heighten that sensitivity and make sure that as that process is going forward, that the team is not, in a sense, inadvertently creating legal risks on the NEPA side.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll move to a question for Keith. How did CDOT manage the discussions with the shortlisted firms after the FEIS, but before the ROD, to ensure that there were no changes to the project that would trigger additional project studies?
Right. Thank you, Susan. That's a good question. What we did, and it's to follow up a little bit on some of what I've heard from on this presentation, is really engage the teams and make them aware of the process and what's happening. You need to give them as much certainty as you can during this process and keep them engaged and involved. So what we did from our perspective is we gave them updates at all of our one-on-one meetings, whether it was a commercial meeting or a technical meeting. We started off with a list of items to keep the teams knowledgeable and informed of where we were at in the entire environmental process. So we walked them through and made sure that they understood and that their equity partners were happy with the progress. We did have a lawsuit after the record of decision on this project, so we had the parallel procurement with the lawsuit. We were successful in extinguishing that lawsuit, and we continued to keep our partner even after selection apprised of where all of the lawsuit ended up there. So it's really just managing expectations and communication on our side. As long as you can provide some certainty, it's usually not a big deal.
Thanks so much. I have a question actually from BATIC. I think that, well, how much does this change depending on the complexity of the project and the type of P3 it is? I mean, there are many states that are doing, the simplest of P3s through a procurement process. And then we have, the more advanced DBFOM, 50-year concession. I'm thinking specifically about the Maryland 495 and 270 project that I know is, I believe, doing NEPA and solicitation concurrently. Do you think the best practices differ depending on the size of the project and how the revenue is going to come back, or is there kind of are there guardrails in place that can apply to any P3 despite its sort of scope and method?
Who is that question for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll direct it to Eric. See if he has thoughts, or Bill.
Sure, I can take a stab, and Bill can elaborate or add. I think there are some kind of standard guardrails that we would have to have in place for a concurrent procurement and NEPA process, but I think naturally there are going to be, the more complex the project, the more specific some of the processes may need to be. As you get into very large projects or programs, like the Maryland project that is likely to have multiple phases of construction, there will be multiple procurements as part of that. The NEPA process will be complete, but it is being complete concurrent with the first procurement phase, and there'll be subsequent ones. And so as those subsequent procurements occur, there's additional opportunity for developers to consider refining design or producing innovation that may require revisiting the underlying NEPA document. So establishing those parameters up front for a large, complex program of projects is important. But on smaller, more simple projects, as you described, although I don't know that any of them are necessarily simple, just the basic establishment of the firewall to ensure, as Bill pointed out in his remarks, to prevent or protect against the perception of a predetermined outcome or undue influence into the decision making. I think those are standard throughout, regardless of the type of project. and just the better information sharing and transparency with the public to help them understand the process, because it is still fairly new.
Sure,
Thanks.
and this is Bill. Oh, I was just going to add on to Eric's comments. You know, one point to consider is that the restrictions on the role of a private party are greater when an EIS is being prepared. So the flexibility to have the applicant involved in preparing the NEPA documentation is greater when it's an EA or in a categorical exclusion. And so that does provide, if you think about the degree to which that private partner can be involved in preparing the NEPA document, it's broader when you're dealing with a less complex project with, you know, less that has less environmental impact. One example that some folks on the call may be familiar with involves a program of bridge improvements in Pennsylvania, where federal highway authorized under the SEP 15 program some exceptions to its normal rules with regard to the role of the private entity can play in preparing NEPA documents. In that case, the bridge improvements were all categorical exclusions. But essentially, this program, under this program, Federal Highway authorized that private party to be preparing those CE documents. So that's really an important distinction, and that may provide greater opportunities to take advantage of the P3 structure when you're dealing with CE or EA projects.
Great, that's very helpful. I think that looking at some of those different examples, and you're right, I mean, I think the degree of the private sector involvement will vary greatly based on the type of project it is and what category. And I think there's a lot of future interest probably in that NEPA assignment responsibility role that those 7 states have taken on. So I think that's definitely an area for future exploration. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up, given that it's approaching 2 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and a huge thanks to our panelists for sharing their very in-depth knowledge on this subject. Again, we'll make sure that we get the webinar slides and videos to you by the end of tomorrow, and we'll post any additional questions. If you have any additional questions you didn't get to, feel free to shoot them my way at showard@ashto.org. And thank you very much. We look forward to having you participate in a future webinar. You'll see here a few of our future events. We're hoping to do another webinar next month, a topic to be determined, but stay in touch with us through our website, financingtransportation.org, and thanks everyone again for participating. Have a great afternoon.